The country of Cuba is starting 2014 with some major economic developments. The first commercial flight from the U.S. since the 1960s took place a few weeks ago, arriving to Havana from Key West, Florida. Foreign automobiles are being imported to Cuba from Europe and the U.S. for the first time in over 50 years. And a painting from an American artist was displayed in a Havana gallery for the first time in 5 decades. Here to shed some light on these historic changes is Washington attorney Jose Pertierra. Jose is well known for defending Elian Gonzalez and specializes in international law. Jose, welcome to the show. You know, there have been many economic changes taking place in Cuba, as we mentioned, from the commercial flights to the car imports, also cell phones. Do you think political change is imminent in Cuba?
Well, I think the economic changes sort of go hand in hand with political changes. And the economic changes are necessary because productivity needs to be raised in Cuba in order for the country to move forward. So there's been a relaxation of the situation of the farmers so that they can have incentives to grow more food. There's many people have been given licenses to engage in private entrepreneurship. There are many restaurants and little shops all over the cities in Cuba. So you see a country that is changing, and almost inevitably it'll lead to political changes. The President Raul Castro, has announced he's not running for re-election. So there's going to be a change in leadership. The Vice President is in his 40s, a man by the name of Diaz-Canel. Many experts think that he will be the next president of Cuba. Political changes are coming, economic changes are there.
It has been 50 years now since this embargo between the U.S. and Cuba, and many believe that that embargo policy just really hasn't worked. Do you think a different approach from the U.S. is needed?
To answer your question, I would start by saying Cuba doesn't belong to the United States, and it is not up to the United States through its politics to effect regime change and to have things work for the United States. What is needed is for a change in policy towards Cuba so that American foreign policy in Latin America and the rest of the world will work. In October, the world voted to condemn the U.S. embargo. Only 2 countries in the world voted for it, the United States and Israel. Latin America has already announced there will be no more summits of the Americas if Cuba is not included. So the United States, in its policy of isolating Cuba, has become isolated itself. So it needs to change its policy for its own good, but not to affect any kind of change in Cuba.
The case of Alan Gross and the Cuban Five, has been a deep source of tension between Cuba and the United States. Do you see an exchange of prisoners, perhaps, to maybe take things down a notch to end the dispute?
I think it is a necessary condition for any kind of normalization of relations that the prisoners be freed, that Alan Gross be freed by Cuba, and that the 4 remaining Cubans that are in U.S. jails be freed as well. I am optimistic that something like this can happen. President Obama has the power under the Constitution of the United States by simply signing an order of executive clemency, not necessarily to pardon the Cubans, but to have them go home under time served. They've been in jail for 15 long years. I am happy to see that Senator Kerry was recently in the Vatican meeting with the Pope and speaking about Cuba, and I would hope that when he says he spoke about Alan Gross to the Pope also raised the issue of the 4 Cubans that are in prison here. Because for humanitarian reasons and also for political reasons, both countries should release the prisoners. It's a relic of the Cold War, and let's move on to the 21st century.
I'd like to ask you about the embargo again. It limits Cuba's use of banks in the United States, and without money, they've been forced to close their consular office here in Washington, D.C. 2 times now. Do you think that can be resolved?
It can be resolved, but first, the United States needs to remove Cuba from the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. Cuba was put on that list for political reasons by the U.S., there isn't a shred of evidence that Cuba supports terrorism or sponsors terrorism. And because it's on the list, banks have to follow a certain set of rules in order to keep accounts for Cuban interests. And in doing so, it costs a bank more money to have Cuba as a client than they can make from having Cuba as a client. And as you know, the bottom line is what counts for banks. So I think if the United States were to relax its policy against Cuba, that banks would then, of course, follow along. It would be just as simple as when France has an account in a U.S. bank.
All right, Mr. Jose Pertierra, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
America's Now.